And welcome to this Martyn Fiddler Aviation webinar on aircraft repossession. Today I am joined by our experts, Greta Kemper and Byrne. And we'll be looking at the factors to consider when contemplating a repossession and why tax and tax considerations really complicate the repossession. So why does the repossession happen in the first place? Well, generally it's because a debt obligation has not been fulfilled, and that might be under the aircraft loan agreement or it might be under a lease agreement. In both circumstances, the lessor or the lender want to take possession of the aircraft to realise some value. And that's really the easy part of this. So Mark, starting with you, what are the factors that a lender or a lessor wants to take into consideration when first looking at an aircraft repossession?
Well, Heather, it's a lot more difficult than most people think. It's not like recovering a car. You sort of turn up with a tow truck and just hitch the car up and take it away. With an aircraft, there's lots of other factors that you've got to take into account. Firstly, and not least of which, there's security. Other people may have a lien over the aircraft ahead of you, in which case you don't want to find yourself taking away an aircraft which is not, rightfully yours to take away. So there are lots of other creditors out there that may have a prior claim on the aircraft ahead of you. So you need to be mindful of that. Next is the location of the aircraft. Where the aircraft is located can have a considerable effect on how you might go about planning to do the repossession. Some jurisdictions are an easy and creditor-friendly place in which to repossess. Other jurisdictions are notoriously difficult to exercise your security. So you need to be mindful of where the aircraft is and how that's going to affect the exercising of your security. Then there's the health of the aircraft. Is it airworthy? Are you actually able to fly the aircraft away safely and in compliance with air navigation orders? So you need to have a good understanding as to what the condition of the aircraft is. The registration of the aircraft will also have an effect on your ability to recover the aircraft. If you're flying the aircraft away, your pilots are going to have to be type rated in the country where the aircraft is registered. And then that may well be easier said than done. And therefore you may need to contemplate re-registering the aircraft as you're repossessing in order that you have pilots type rated to fly the aircraft away. And then there's a question of actual ownership of the aircraft as well. You might be financing the aircraft and you might be leasing the aircraft, but who is the real legal owner of the aircraft and what are their rights and obligations under those circumstances? So those are just some of the considerations that need to be thought about, and we haven't even mentioned the tax word.
Well, now that you have mentioned the tax word, I think we probably want to turn to Greta and say, Greta, why does tax complicate all the factors which Mark has just mentioned?
Okay, when we're talking about tax here, we're not just talking about the VAT, we're also talking about the tax, the import status, the customs free circulation status that the aircraft may have in any particular territory. The reason that's important is because it's going to inform your decisions as to where you take the aircraft and where you can do things with it. And when I talk about free circulation status, for anybody who's not aware, what I'm talking about is an aircraft that's maybe been manufactured in that territory and sold while it's been within that territory, or an aircraft that's been imported. And from a tax perspective, the first thing that you need to do is to ensure that you have all the paperwork to identify whether the aircraft has free circulation status and VAT paid status or not. So, for example, with an aircraft manufactured within the territory, it might be an invoice from the manufacturer to the first purchaser, the subsequent invoice from that purchaser to the next purchaser. If it's an aircraft that's been imported, you would be looking to get paperwork on imports, import certificates, export certificates, any evidence that the aircraft has been held outside the territory or sold outside the territory, which may impact its free circulation status. And of course, as of the 1st of January 2021, Brexit is also a factor, because that's also something that may have affected EU imported aircraft that may no longer have free circulation status in, say, both the EU and the UK. So once you've got your paperwork and you have your background information as to the aircraft status, the kind of things that you're looking for when you look at a repossession is who is going to repossess the aircraft, on what basis are they going to repossess it on. Repossession basis might be, for example, physically taking possession of the aircraft. It might be walking possession of the company. And the reason the way it's been repossessed is important is because you're looking out for the kind of things where, for example, title has been transferred as part of that process, which could potentially create a tax point for VAT purposes and may affect the aircraft's import status depending on where it physically is at the time. The other key things that you're going to be thinking about post-repossession is, what about any VAT costs incurred? For example, possibly storage, repair and maintenance, VAT on legal costs. Is the person who has taken possession of the aircraft able to reclaim these costs? The VAT costs, is any other party able to reclaim them, for example? What if the aircraft wasn't able to move and is currently sitting in a territory where none of the parties involved have a VAT registration? You're then looking to try and reclaim VAT via a lengthy either 8th or 13th directive process in the EU or the equivalents in the UK. And finally, the kind of thing you're going to be thinking about is, will any of the customs relief provisions help you in terms of avoiding tax issues? So, for example, we're talking about customs warehousing and inward processing, useful for storage, repair and maintenance, sale of the aircraft once you're at that point, or potentially release. Just to bear in mind that some of the EU member states, for example, will permit air to be sold while under a relief without VAT applying, and some won't. The UK, which is obviously no longer part of the EU, does permit such sales. And just to point out that since the 1st of January 2021, as the UK has lost the EU, it's now in an equivalent position to, say, Guernsey or Jersey. So worth considering for closing sales in the UK in future.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Greta. So I think we can now see that there's a lot of factors to consider, and then you add tax on top, I should say. So Mark, with all of this, which is all rather complicated, when should you start planning for repossession?
Well, there are 3 occasions when you can start planning for a repossession. The best time to start planning is when you're creating the financing or the leasing right at the beginning, when you're writing the contract with the other parties. Contracts, of course, can end in 2 ways. One, they're successfully completed and the transaction is a complete success and everybody gets what they need out of it. Alternatively, though, contracts sometimes fail. And under those circumstances, you need to be thinking about the possibility of having to repossess your aircraft. If you do it at the beginning, when you've got plenty of time to sort of think about the contract and the relationships and how the parties are going to be behaving and where the aircraft may potentially be, then you can start to put into the contract how this repossession process is going to work. So the best time to do it is right at the very beginning, when you're contemplating the contract in its entirety. The second best time is today. If you didn't plan it when you started the contractual process, the next best time is to do it before the contract is in any kind of peril or jeopardy. And that means planning today, whilst you still have the time and space to contemplate how you would go about dealing with the matter if push came to shove and you needed to do it. The last occasion that you can plan from a repossession is when you actually need to do it. And I suggest that that's probably the worst time to start planning, albeit you're forced to do it at that time, because you're under pressure, and because you're under pressure, perhaps matters that need to be given proper consideration are overlooked, or alternatively, simple mistakes are made, unforced errors are made, and you may well end up repossessing the aircraft, but buying yourself a whole heap of trouble into the process. So I think it's really important to do your planning ahead of time, preferably at the very beginning, and if not at the beginning, then immediately or as soon as you really can. And having done your planning, of course, matters change over time. I like to think of it as being a pilot flying an aircraft. Obviously, you know where your destination is, you know where you need to get to, But a pilot will always be contemplating what would they do if something happened right now that made them go for a forced landing, for example. Factors change all the time, and therefore I suggest that having planned at the appropriate time at the beginning or today, that you review your plan over time to ensure that it's still fit for purpose. And of course, when you come to actually implement it, you need to review it all over again as well. But at least you're starting from a point where you've got a plan already in place that you can pick up from. Over to you.
Thank you. So, Greta, given Mark's three-stage plan, or 3 times when you can start thinking about repossession, or you should be thinking about repossession, what about planning the tax consequences? When can you build that into the plan?
I think going back to Mark's 3-stage process, the most important thing for tax, the thing that is going to give you your starting point, is going to be holding this history record of imports and manufactured aircraft you're invoicing. And you would preferably arrange for that to be obtained at the beginning of a lease. In the process, you would set up a regular record and have a regular check-in so that you've got that information and are ready to start making your tax decisions as soon as you need to do. The other thing I would point out is that from our perspective and our experience, every aircraft is different. It's really important to look at each individual aircraft's circumstances, and we would obviously always recommend taking advice to make sure that you don't make an expensive mistake. And the kind of risks you're talking about are VAT on the cost of the aircraft, or potentially it's open to customs authorities to seize your aircraft. So there's not a lot of point being able to repossess your aircraft if it's then taken away from you because of some customs error that's been made.
Great, thank you very much. So sort of bringing this into some sort of summary, maybe Greta, Mark, you can give me some of your top tips or practical realities, thoughts and opinions. Greta, I'll fire at you first.
Okay, I think I'd probably reiterate most of what we've said. Definitely get the background history to the aircraft and update that as often as possible. Bear in mind that every aircraft is different. We can give you a high-level view on how these things work, but in terms of individual aircraft, you need to look at their individual circumstances. And finally, just bear in mind the possibility that the UK is also now a possible place of closing for anybody outside of the EU.
Great. And Mark?
Well, from my perspective, plan early and plan well. And bearing in mind all of the different factors that go into the repossession, there's obviously a lot of different aspects to the repossession, whether it's from a technical perspective, from a legal ownership perspective, the financing perspective, and the tax perspective. There are experts out there that can help deal with all of these matters, and somebody needs to coordinate them. The last thing you want to be doing is, when you come to repossessing, is reaching for the phone book, looking for those experts, and so that you can engage with them. I think you need to build those relationships as you're doing your planning, in order that when the time comes, you know who to call to get the help that you need. So I think it's important to do the planning early, review the planning, and also have a team that you know that can come together when you come to repossess the aircraft on that unfortunate day. Those would be my thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Mark and Greta. So, what do we say? There's a lot of factors to consider when looking at a repossession. Tax can only complicate those factors, and plan for a repossession before you even know you might need one. Thank you very much for joining us. Please catch up on this as well as our other webinars on our website, martynfiddler.aero. And until the next time, thank you and goodbye.